Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today we'll be talking about New Year's resolutions and really how we can take some of those trends and those strategies and apply them to OT cybersecurity as well. Um, and so, we know that the start of the year that we, a lot of times like to make resolutions, whether it is being healthier, exercising more, um, eating more fruits and vegetables, whatever it is that we make a resolution for in the new year. A lot of times it's a good idea to start, but as we get going, um, we can really start to lose track of those goals, and they'll end up falling to the back burner. And so when we look at this year, we'll talk about, well, what can we do to try to change that when it comes to OT cybersecurity? And what can we do to have a more successful year? So before jumping into the content, I want to give just a real quick update on GoToWebinar. So that is the application that we use for our webinars. And so if you do have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, there is a questions tool that will show up on the right side of your screen. And so don't hesitate to ask a question at any point in the presentation. We should have about 15 or so minutes at the end of the presentation where I'll go through and answer all of the questions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Patrick O'Brien, and I am a senior safety and cybersecurity engineer at Exida. My background is in chemical engineering, so I started out really primarily on the safety side, everything from process hazard analysis through the safety life cycle. I have worked with many different plants, many different industries. And about 5 years ago now, I also started to be heavily involved with the cybersecurity aspects and looking at how we can secure the control systems for those chemical plants and industrial facilities. And as part of that, I've had the opportunity to work on a couple of different books. We have the exida book, Implementing IEC 62443, A Pragmatic Approach. And then last year, we also partnered with the Centers for Chemical Process Safety to publish a new concept book, Managing Cybersecurity in the Process Industry, a risk-based approach. So very fortunate to be able to work on those projects and help to, let's say, write the narrative a little bit about how we can take these cybersecurity concepts and really apply them to OT environments. At Exida, we are a customer-focused company, and we work in 3 different areas. We have enterprise tools such as Exlentia, where we can really support the full lifecycle for functional safety, alarm management, and cybersecurity. So to really use those tools to get to our desired results. We have a certification and assessment group that provides certification to a number of standards for functional safety as well as cybersecurity. And then lastly, we have lifecycle services, which is the area I primarily work in, where we work directly with customers to solve their toughest challenges for safety, cybersecurity, and alarm. And so that's just some real quick background on Exida. And now we'll go ahead and jump into the content for today's webinar. And I want to start off with a quote that I think does a really good job of really summarizing how a lot of people view New Year's resolution. So my New Year's resolution is to stop procrastinating. I'm not going to start until next week though, right? There's that idea that we can always push getting started off. As things come up, our priorities just tend to shift and fluctuate. And when I started to tackle this topic, I wanted to do a little bit of research and figure out, why is it so hard to stick with a resolution for the year? What keeps us from making progress? And so if we look at the percentage of people who set a resolution at the beginning of a year and follow through with it, at the end of the year, it's really only 25% of people that have, or slightly less than 25% of people that are able to say that they stuck with their resolution and applied it for the year. And we see with this curve, it starts, even at a pretty sharp drop off, where in less than a week or two, already a quarter of people are out. And it then slowly starts to slip down until by the end of the year, very few people are left. And so if we dig deeper and ask, why is this happening? There were a couple of key reasons why so many people were unable to stick with the resolutions. One was unrealistic goals. So over a third of people maybe set a goal that was too hard to achieve, or they didn't have time to do it. If I said I was going to exercise 7 times a week, just knowing myself, knowing my schedule, that's not going to happen. Another big one was failing to track progress, so not keeping track of the resolution, not seeing if they were actually eating healthier, because again, they really had no way to compare what they were eating one year to the next. Forgetting about the resolution entirely, not tracking it, not having reminders, and really just having it completely fall out of their mind. And then the last one, too many resolutions. So maybe instead of picking one thing to focus on, they picked 5 or 6, and trying to keep up with all of them was just too much, and they ended up not keeping up with any of them. And so if you're wondering why we're spending so much time talking about New Year's resolutions, you might be able to guess that a lot of these are actually the same challenges that ICS, Industrial Control System, or OT organizations face with initiatives or really anything on top of keeping the plant running that they try to do. And if we look at some general trends from the ICS environments, installed base age continues to rise, and we've got many legacy systems out there that are difficult to support. Cybersecurity exposure is not just increasing, it's increasing exponentially, and we can see from a lot of different studies from the number of OT organizations that are being targeted for attacks, the numbers experiencing negative consequences from cybersecurity incidents. There's a lot of things that are really rapidly increasing that exposure. We also see that the control and process engineer responsibilities continue to grow. We're asking fewer people to do more things. We are always giving them additional tasks, additional responsibilities, and the availability of resources. So the number of people that we have available, the amount of time they have, that's continuing to decrease. And so when we look at this, picture or this background for the OT environment, we can see a lot of those same challenges where we've got limited resource, limited availability, and we need to use that to do more and more things. And so it's easy to imagine having too many initiatives where we can't keep up with them, or not having the time to track our goals and really starting to lose that progress. And so what we're going to focus on today is what can we do to make those ICS cybersecurity initiatives more successful or improve their successfulness. And so the first thing we can think about is defining the need and really clearly stating what it is we're trying to accomplish and why it matters, why we need to do something about it. Next, we can look at setting realistic goals, understanding where we are, understanding what is achievable to get to, and setting goals based on that. And then lastly, we can talk about tracking progress and really making sure that we stay on target. And even if we're not staying on target, maybe we can identify why and make adjustments. So having that tracked progress really gives us more opportunities to adjust as needed. And so if we think about ICS cybersecurity, why do we need a strategy? Why do we need to start that initiative or really make cybersecurity a focus for those OT organizations? And so the fact of the matter is industrial control systems are just extremely vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. 90% of ICS organizations that were surveyed between 2017 and 2019 experienced a damaging attack. And so that means they had some sort of cybersecurity incident that resulted in lost production, lost efficiency, maybe the need to replace components. So there was some attack that either had a negative financial or operational impact. the amount of tools available to hackers is increasing all the time. We're seeing more and more ransomware kits where a relatively unskilled attacker can deploy a sophisticated ransomware virus or malware throughout the system. We are also seeing more tools that are specifically targeting OT organizations to allow attackers to gain an initial foothold or go after different communication methods that are common in ICS or OT systems. So those tools are becoming more and more readily available. From the exposure side, we're seeing more and more remote access required for operating environments, and now 70% of industrial control systems require some type of remote access. And we can just think how much that has grown since COVID, and really the need for controls and process engineers to be able to access their equipment remotely and understand what's happening. And while that's a critical need for operations, we have to realize that if our employees can remotely access the system and gain information, it's possible that attackers can as well. And another thing that we saw really right at the start of COVID in March of 2020 was that the amount of remote desktop protocol ports, so things used for remote access that were unsecure and basically directly facing the internet, jumped 50% from 3 to 4.5 million. So we could even see that giant really step increase of the amount of remote access and the amount of exposure there. And then the last thing we can think about, specific to that installed base, is that legacy equipment, as it gets older, in many cases it has limited or no protection. And so even if it does have some security features, as the product ages, if those can no longer be patched and updated, things like antivirus are not going to be successful if their definitions haven't been updated for 6 months or a year. And more sophisticated countermeasures that have been developed recently may not be supported by those older devices. So for all of those reasons, we have to accept that it is a fact of our current environment that these ICS systems are extremely vulnerable to cyber threats. We can also see that there are a lot of different forces that are influencing and driving this adoption of cybersecurity for ICSs. We've got national standards and regulations. In the US, we've had a couple of executive orders really focused on improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and critical industries. A number of countries in Europe and Asia have also rolled out new cybersecurity laws. And again, that is something that is happening globally. We've got stakeholder expectations. So companies, again, are expecting to see return on investment. There is more drive for uptime, for profitability, adjusting to all of the supply chain disruptions. So stakeholders expect that those control systems are up and running. And if cybersecurity is a threat to that, that's something that the stakeholders really need to make sure is addressed. We're seeing industry standards, particularly the IEC 62443 series of standards, that is really being adopted and gaining traction against many different organizations. We're also seeing things like insurance requirements, particularly in the US, but in other parts of the world as well, where companies or groups of companies are trying to establish cybersecurity insurance policies. But again, there are a lot of challenges there in understanding what sort of risk the insurance company is taking on and what sort of protections that they would need to see in place to even consider coverage. And so for all of these different reasons, there's really a need for facilities to manage their risk and specifically to manage their cybersecurity risk. We can also think about the different groups within the organization that have their own priorities and have their own drivers for cybersecurity. On the ICS or the OT side for operations, availability, integrity, and confidentiality are the orders of priority. So we need to make sure that availability is met first, that our systems are up and running, that they are producing whatever it is that our site produces. Meanwhile, for IT, it's all about confidentiality. And so the typical CIA acronym is focus about confidentiality above all else, prevent data leaks, prevent loss of confidential information. And if you have to turn off a laptop or a server for an hour to refresh or install a security feature, on the IT side, that's typically no problem. But for OT, we can't just turn off a controller for an hour and then reset. We will have shut down the entire facility. And so we have to understand that different groups are going to approach cybersecurity in different ways. And one of the really big buzzwords that has been growing for the last couple of years is IT and OT convergence. The idea that if we can use the existing IT resources and infrastructure and just apply that to OT, we've already got this great start. Why don't we just move that over? And that's something that's going to help us quickly improve cybersecurity. And if OT just follows what IT does, security will be much better. Now, that is a little bit of an oversimplification or a little bit of a straw man. And the idea is not to say that IT and OT convergence is going anywhere. That is something that is going to be a core driver, and it is going to be here to stay in OT ICS environments. But we have to be careful when we look at it and when we think about applying really the IT resources to those ICS specific needs. And we can almost think about, threading together all of those different approaches and all of those different drivers. So on the one side, we've got those existing IT resources. We've got the, technological solutions that they're using, whether it is monitoring and things like, updated antivirus deployment, firewalls, all of those good things for security that are already in place on the IT side. We can think about those existing IT policies and procedures. But then what we've got to do is we've got to balance that with the specific needs of the ICS systems, with their the constraints, the fact that availability has to be the number one priority, the installed base, those legacy devices, and then as well as those best practices and industry standards that really look at how to apply cybersecurity for ICS. And with those together, we need to think about a coordinated and a robust strategy that is ICS specific, but does leverage those benefits and those existing strengths from the IT side. And so once we can set that need and say, okay, we are going after that OT approach for our organization, we've got a business need to drive it. The question is, well, then how do we get started? What sort of goals should we set? What sort of timeline should we be on? And I think the first thing that I want to say very clearly is that no goal is too small when it comes to cybersecurity, and we're going to start with simple steps that ultimately build the foundation for improved cybersecurity. And so I'll talk about maybe a couple different options of what those goals might be, just to get an idea, just to get the ball rolling. So first, we could think about training. We need to have competent people in order to really be successful. So it could be as simple as identifying one or more people within your organization and saying, yes, they need to start to learn more about cybersecurity. There are training courses, certificate programs, and also some personnel certifications that can really help with that. The next option could be to assess current gaps. We could say, hey, we know we've got a lot of different control systems. We're going to pick one and get started and try to understand what sort of exposure, what sort of cybersecurity risk do they have. And then the last option could be, hey, we know that we don't have a lot of mature systems in place, but we really need to start documenting them for the OT environment. And we just want to dive right in. We want to focus on cybersecurity management. And so we'll talk a little bit about what those goals might look like for each of the options. So if we start with cybersecurity awareness and lifecycle training, this is really that building block or that start for future activities. something that we see time and time again is that we can put all of the technology-based controls that we want, but people are going to be that weak point in security. They are clicking on phishing emails still. They are, not using strong passwords. There are just so many kind of little things that we need to do, that a lot of times those will fall through the crack. And so cyber hygiene, or those best practices that need to be implemented by all personnel, may just be missed or not done as consistently as they should be. Competency is something that is a direct requirement from international standards. In the IEC 62443 standard, there are explicit needs, whether it is the asset owner operating, the service provider doing integration work or ongoing maintenance services, or even the product supplier. There are competency requirements for each of those stakeholders to have people who understand cybersecurity, who understand the impacts of specific actions related to cybersecurity. And then another thing to think about, even if it wasn't a requirement, by building competency, by building understanding within the team, this is how you can help establish that buy-in, and really build confidence in the direction that the organization is going, and make sure that it's not just being driven by one person, that the employees it's impacting understand the need and understand their involvement. And so often, as I said, the human element becomes that weak point in cybersecurity. And a study that was done back in 2018 found that nearly 80% of all insider cybersecurity attacks are unintentional. And so we've got 64% arising from employer contractor negligence. And so what negligence means is there wasn't a specific motive to cause harm. They didn't decide that they were going to go out and plug in a ransomware and try to extort the company for money, but there was a decision to act inappropriately. So maybe they decided to charge their phone even though they knew they weren't supposed to, and a virus came over, or they plugged in a personal laptop because they wanted to charge it while they were watching a Netflix movie on shift. So there is something that was not good cybersecurity behavior that then allowed an opportunity for a virus or some type of attack to connect to the system. And then 13% was from credential theft. So we could think about things like clicking on phishing emails, providing passwords, providing confidential information accidentally. And one of the common misconceptions that we see time and time again is that many employees incorrectly believe that their actions have no impact on cybersecurity. So they are just going to get through their day. They're going to do whatever it is they need to, and really don't pay it any mind. Don't expect to have any impact on cybersecurity. And that's one of the things that we need to address with awareness training. And so if we think about what cybersecurity hygiene looks like, the first thing is being aware of the potential sources of cybersecurity risk, helping employees to identify phishing emails, helping them to know what a suspicious website looks like, and again, making sure that they are not connecting any devices there to the OT network, that they're not entering in their OT-specific credentials for those phishing emails, being wary of USB devices and realizing that that is one of the main ways that viruses get onto industrial systems. Also thinking that they need to actively be following best practices for security, strong and unique passwords, getting rid of unused accounts, keeping their devices up to date, and even things as simple as limiting how much personal information is online. It's amazing what some of these targeted phishing attacks, how much information they can gather about people, how they can easily impersonate them or make it seem like they know that person just from what is available to anyone online. And so in addition to those awareness pieces, again, as I mentioned, there are those specific requirements in the ISA IEC 62443 standards. And so in 2-1 for the asset owners, it talks about, the cybersecurity has to be implemented, including the personnel that surround and use those industrial control systems. And that when assigning roles and responsibilities, that they need to be assigned to qualified personnel. So they have to be competent to do the activities that they've been assigned. And then when we think about personnel competency, it's not necessarily that one size fits all. There are different tiers for different types of personnel. So a certificate, if we think at the lowest level, that base level is just awareness. So making sure that everyone who connects to the control system is aware of their impact. And that could be as simple as a 1 or 2 hour OT specific awareness training that's completed. And then the next level up from there would be a practitioner or a certificate program where someone with cybersecurity lifecycle responsibilities goes through a course, demonstrates that they understood the material, and that they've got that foundational understanding. And then from there, certification programs look to really specifically assess that competency. They look at things like amount of practical experience in the field. They look at educational background, as well as case studies and examples. And so the CACS would be that 5-year benchmark of relevant experience, and then that CACE would be that 10+ years of competency. And again, really that gold standard or that top in demonstrating OT specific cybersecurity understanding. And so depending on the responsibilities, employees may target any one of those areas. And so those are some examples of what could be targeted for option 1, starting with training. For option 2, we can think about really identifying those gaps within the organization. Knowing where we are is one of those keys to taking a step forward, because if we don't know where we are, we don't know what the right direction to go in may be. And assessing that exposure, assessing those gaps can help us plan or identify those future activities. It can be a really good start for a roadmap because we can identify those smaller problems and break this big complex topic that is cybersecurity into smaller manageable steps that we're going to be more likely to be able to handle and track and make progress on. And one of the first things that we need to do is determine our current state. And an idiom that we use a lot of times in the US is, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. So we've got things that at the start could seem like this massive, unattainable goal. But really, if we step back and get some perspective, maybe it's really just a small mound of dirt, not a giant mountain. On the other hand, maybe we take a look when we get started and we see we do have a really far way to go. We want to understand where that starting point is so we can take the step that is best tailored for it, whether we have small steps that we can take to really make improvements, or whether we need a little bit of a more tailored approach, really targeting some of those key major exposure issues that we've identified. And that's really where a gap assessment can come in and give that better understanding of the existing exposure, of the existing risk. And one of the concepts that we use to really try to help define that and put maybe a better description on it is the attack surface or the attack surface area. And so the attack surface is the vulnerabilities that are reachable and exploitable by threat agents. So that is how much exposure you have that could be targeted. And then we kind of talk about the attack surface area being if we add up all of those different attack surfaces. So ways that someone could get to a system through the network. So do we have exposed endpoints? Do we have enabled web servers where they could get onto OT devices from the internet? We could look at software and hardware. Are we running legacy systems that have known vulnerabilities? Are we running applications that we don't necessarily need on OT environments that have known vulnerabilities that could be exploited? And also that social engineering, that human aspect. Do we have more accounts than we need? Are people aware? Are they routinely clicking on phishing links? Are they using USBs when they shouldn't? really to be effective, a gap assessment has to look at all of those areas and really tell us something about the overall or the total exposure of a site or an organization. And the idea is that, a gap assessment is not meant to be something where you spend, weeks and weeks and weeks figuring out what all the problems are, and you will not take any steps forward until you have granular identified everything that is wrong with the system. And sometimes we see organizations can get what we call analysis paralysis, where they're spending so much time analyzing, their risks and where they are that they never take that step forward. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that. Instead, we want to balance, all right, how can we get as much information as possible about the site or about the organization in as little time as possible? And so that's something where we might target it to be a 2 or 3 day activity. um, you know, Meet with the team, handle introductions, go through their strategy for cybersecurity management. We can do that against things like the IEC 62443 standard. We can look at the NIST cybersecurity framework. So cover that management piece, cover physical security issues. Again, if someone can just walk up to a control system and plug in a USB, it doesn't matter how much time or money we spend on cybersecurity, and we're not going to be successful. We can do some simple non-invasive network scans to gain information about the system. And we can also look at doing a very simple high-level risk assessment, just focusing on consequence, really making sure that we understand what the exposure, what the risk is for the system. And so that gives an idea of how quickly in 2 or so days we can try to gain more information about the system. And so from a lot of the gap assessments that we've done, we've got a good idea of some common findings when we put together that snapshot of where a site or company is. So some positive findings, we don't want to say that it's all doom and gloom. There definitely has overall been improvement in cybersecurity awareness. There is still a ways to go, but companies are becoming more aware. It's becoming more of a focus. There is a lot of, let's say, general supplier management that's in place. So using, let's say, certified vendors and certified integrators, using, again, that same integrator, having trust with them, making sure that they understand the system. So that's a piece of it. And we're starting to apply security concepts more frequently to OT environments. Basic device hardening, things like antivirus or whitelisting, trying to patch systems, again, even if it's not all the time, whether it's yearly or quarterly. A lot of sites are starting to get there. But some things that we're seeing as a common tripping points or common gaps would be things like no structured process, not clearly defining roles and responsibilities, not having communication within the organization, not having any or not having complete documentation. And what all of those things mean is if we don't have the program or the documentation in place, we don't have repeatability of security activities. Maybe we've got a really good control engineer who's handling everything right now, but when they retire or if they move to a different role or a different company, we're going to lose all of those security activities. They may not have a good understanding of the risk or a risk-driven approach, and they may have trouble explaining or defining what their cybersecurity requirements are. Something that an integrator might see a lot is a company saying, hey, give me a system and it needs to be cyber secure. Make sure that it is secure and that it can't be hacked. And that is something that is a really broad requirement that you can't design to. So we need to think about defining those requirements more granularly. And that takes us into one of our last options for getting started, which is diving into that cybersecurity management system. And this is a good fit for companies that know where some of their gaps are and say, hey, we know we're not strong in this and we could do a gap assessment, but we really just want to get started. So let's roll out that cybersecurity management system or that CSMS. And this really gives you that robust cybersecurity strategy. It outlines what the organization is going to do from cybersecurity. And so this can be a case where, again, if you know you've got big gaps, instead of doing a report that reiterates that, you may want to start with closing some of the ones that you know you have. And when we look at those common gaps from the gap assessments, the CSMS can address many of those. So the structure, the documentation, that is something that is explicitly addressed in the CSMS. And then for the lifecycle activities and risk assessment, specific standards and procedures under that CSMS can help with those tasks. And so this is where that CSMS can define key parts of the cybersecurity approach, things like the scope of the CSMS, so where that break between IT and OT systems are, the specific security program elements from the IEC 62443 standards, the cybersecurity lifecycle activity, things with competency, so the training and cybersecurity awareness, incident response and business continuity plans of how you respond when an incident does occur. And then lastly, really that piece for compliance, conducting periodic audits, having set time to review and improve that CSMS, update it as needed. And this is really something that has to happen for the CSMS to be successful. The last thing to note here on the cybersecurity management system is that using templates and using whatever tools are available can really cut down on the amount of time required to create that CSMS. It gives you a starting point. It takes less time and energy to get there. You can roll out the procedures more quickly. Make sure that those baseline ISA/IEC 62443 requirements are already included and captured. Make sure that industry best practices are included. And the idea is basically to have easy to use uniform formats so that you can roll out those procedures across the organization. And this is something that exida has developed a number of template sets. We've got an end user one, an integrator specific one focusing on 2-4, and also an OEM one for secure development practices. And really the goal there is just to cut down on the amount of time required and make it easier for organizations who are looking to get started. And this is something that, talking with a couple of customers, we've heard things like, this saved us 6 months in development time because instead of starting from scratch, we had something that was 80% there and we just had to customize it. So it just helps to make that step a little bit easier, make that goal a little bit more attainable. And so the last piece we'll look at is tracking performance. And this is something that, regardless of which of those steps we pick, whether we start with training or we jump right into building a management system, we need to track how we're doing, because that can help us to build momentum and also make adjustments if we see that we are going off course. So we want to take credit for all of our wins, even if they're small. Even if this year all we can do is get 2 sites through cybersecurity awareness training, or get a program leader through a life cycle training course and get them to really start more actively participating in those life cycle activities, that can be a win, even if it's just one person. We want to demonstrate how we're making progress, and again, build that buy-in, build that momentum. And these small steps, starting with competency, can help to achieve larger steps in the future. And that's where we can really, again, once we start to move, we can plan out that roadmap and understand the timing of those different activities. And then the other thing is, if we're not making progress, if we're having those periodic check-ins and we really aren't making movement, maybe we need to adjust our goals or adjust our initial targets. And so when we think about the roadmap, this is not a one-size-fits-all, but there are some general steps that we commonly see when building a cybersecurity roadmap. And it really does all start with competency. So if people don't understand their role, don't understand the core concepts, it can be very difficult to implement competency. We can also think about the gap assessment, understanding where your current gaps are to then target future roadmap steps. Building that cybersecurity management system is a key step to help close some of those gaps. We can then put together the roadmap for more detailed activities. If we're going to make technical changes like a change to the network architecture, implement additional control technologies, we want to plan out what the timing is for those different activities, understand which of our sites are most critical, and then roll that program out, starting with our highest risk or highest criticality assets, and then eventually moving it to the entire organization, with that last piece being that performance tracking, because we need to, again, make sure we know where we are. And the last quote that I want to just end on today is one from Mark Twain. And the secret of getting ahead is getting started. And the secret of getting started is breaking your complex, overwhelming tasks into small, manageable tasks and starting on the first one. And so again, whatever our resolutions are, if we're trying to make life cycle changes, being healthy is a tricky thing to do. There's a lot that goes into it. But if we break that into smaller tasks like, going for a walk twice a week, exercising one time a week, trying to have more vegetables, one meal a day, whatever it is, if we can break it up into smaller pieces, we're going to be more successful. And cybersecurity for OT environments, it's hard to think of a more complex or overwhelming task than that sometimes. So instead of just saying we're going to tackle cybersecurity, let's break that down into smaller pieces. Let's say, hey, this year we're going to improve cybersecurity competency, or we're going to understand what our gaps are for one or two sites. Whatever it is, if we start small, if we define each of those specific tasks, we're going to have a better chance of getting started, and we're not going to be able to get anywhere until we get started. So that is really the key thing, that we need to get the ball rolling, and everything builds off of that initial first step. All right, so we've got about 15 or so minutes. If you did find this webinar topic interesting and want to hear more about similar topics, don't hesitate to follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Again, don't hesitate to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to keep the conversation going there. If you have suggestions for other webinar topics, you can send them into academy@exida.com or reach out to me over email or over LinkedIn. And we also can be found on the website. We've got a number of different reference material, different webinars, white papers, blogs, all of that type of information. Okay, so let's go ahead and give people just a chance to ask some questions. And I have a couple of questions too that I can ask, and if people want, they can kind of share any answers to that in the questions portion. So I think the first question that I would have is, does anyone here have any cybersecurity goals for the year that they're thinking about or would like to share, or any ideas where they would want to get started? Okay, so I've got one question here. So the first one is, if I'm looking to do cybersecurity awareness training, is there a good place to start, or what sort of resources are generally available? So I think there are kind of two ways to look at it. So the first one would be, There are lots of free webinars, both by Exida and other groups like ISA, where there's a lot of great information that you can start with just to be more aware, get some of the background. So that's one piece of getting started. But there are also some specific training course options. So I know we offer a simple 1-hour course that is online self-paced, where say you were trying to develop competency for a site, that could be something where, those 10 operators, each have access and periodically, maybe once a year, we'll go through and take that training. So that is one option. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, so this question is, for a gap assessment, is that always something that needs to be looked at for a site? Could it be looked at for an organization as a whole or a business unit? Um, so for that one, um, the focus of the risk assessment um, can really, or the gap assessment can really be specified by the company. So for example, if you've got one specific site that you want to look at, you would start with a site-specific gap assessment. If you don't know which site to start with, but you have policies and procedures, you could look at that for the overall organization, or that is something where um, maybe you focus on a business unit because each business unit has different policies. So that's something where, again, it'll really depend on the organization and how they're structured. Okay, so this next question here, can you repeat which part of the 62443 standard is suitable for system integrators? Yes, so from a policy and procedure standpoint, it is the 2-4 portion of the standard that they're going to follow. And then if they're developing an overall system, then it may be the 3-3 portion of the standard that they look at for the system requirements. Okay. So the next question here is, we want to implement a cybersecurity risk assessment as required by IEC 61511, but don't know where to start and when. So we could think about, and kind of the options here are the concept phase, design phase, or as-built stress test. So thinking about, okay, in the 61511 standard, just for some background, in the 2016 version, there is a requirement that any safety instrumented system and the connected systems to the SIS needs to have a cybersecurity risk assessment, basically to identify, is there a chance that a cyber attack could render the SIS inoperative and lead to a dangerous failure? So that's a new type of failure that we need to look at. And so for that case, it may be good to kind of start with almost a simple gap or a simple risk assessment, which could be that as-built stress test, where you kind of jump into the concept or analysis phase for your existing system and say, okay, these are the specific risks that we're facing, and then do we need to go further into the life cycle, or does what we have now meet these requirements? So that's something that we could definitely talk about the best way to approach it. And again, thinking about putting a tailored plan that really makes sense for your organization there. Okay, so this question, what are your thoughts on the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act? Will it help industries that don't fit into the IEC 62443 and ISO 21434 standards? So I think the short answer is it is certainly going to drive activity. Um, I will say that I have not gone through all of the specifics of what will be included, but the initial takeaways from what I've looked at are, it is certainly going to have more requirements, and some industries that I'll say in the past, not necessarily that 62443 doesn't apply to them, but that they don't want it to apply to them, or kind of want to stick with their own approach, that it will certainly increase the awareness and push those organizations to really have to do more. Um, and I think that ultimately some of those industry standards will still help provide the specific steps of how do you complete those resilience activities. But again, companies are going to take a balanced approach, but it certainly is going to up the focus that it is given to it. Okay. So then this next one here, what skills are necessary for automation engineers entering the OT cybersecurity domain? So I think the nice thing is that a lot of the technical background and the understanding that they need, about the types of systems, about some of the availability constraints and the technology uses, automation engineers already have that. So that's at least half the battle. Um, in terms of the additional skills to add on to that, now you're really talking about, okay, what are the OT cybersecurity specific pieces of knowledge that they need? And so that would come down to being familiar with the relevant standards. So we kind of highly recommend IEC 62443 for the OT cybersecurity domain. We've seen it work very well and really be used by many different organizations across many different industries. So getting some knowledge on the standards, understanding the risk assessment approach and how that may differ from some traditional IT business risk assessments, and also then some of those core cybersecurity controls or countermeasures. And so for people looking to get started, we do have the CS 100 course for the cybersecurity lifecycle, and that's a 4-day course that does a really good job of basically breaking it down step by step and kind of walking you through everything you would need to know if you're just getting into that OT cybersecurity space. So that is something that I would definitely recommend considering. Okay, this next one is, would it be better to conduct a risk assessment for cyber HAZOP and HAZOP at the same time? So this is something that I have seen companies try to do both ways. So if you think about it, the benefit of doing a HAZOP and cyber HAZOP at the same time is you've already got everyone in the room and you just had them go together. Basically just you have everyone in the room, you do your HAZOP, you do your cyber HAZOP. The reality is that doesn't tend to work as well because you may need different people for the HAZOP and different people for the cyber HAZOP or cyber risk assessment. Just an example would be a HAZOP might have 10 people in the room, including multiple process safety engineers, equipment packages. And then when we get to the cyber risk assessment, we might need one representative from that group or questions from that group, but it'll primarily be the controls engineers and the network focus. And then the other thing is, because the results of the HAZOP are really needed as an input to the cyber risk assessment, we need to know what can go wrong in the physical process to assess the risks of, again, someone remotely triggering that. A lot of times it's best to wait until you have all of your HAZOP scenarios to then filter and pick just the ones that apply to cyber HAZOP. So because of that, I would strongly recommend having your HAZOP completed, or at least mostly completed, before you do the cyber risk assessment. Okay, so this next one, I've heard from some controllers, an example being from the petrochemical sites, that they intend to move process safety away from PLCs and implement it by using off-the-shelf independent or off-grid controllers, depending on the process, things like safety relays, and no longer using network-enabled components. Is this something that's becoming a noticeable trend? And so I'll say that this is something that I am seeing. Whether or not I would call it a full-blown trend, I probably wouldn't go that far yet. And really the idea is, if a safety system can be hacked, you've got to implement cybersecurity protections to prevent that and achieve your risk goals. But if you implement something that is a non-hackable safeguard, the simplest example would be a mechanical pressure relief device, then you don't have the additional cybersecurity requirements. And so what some companies are looking at is, well, hey, if instead of sticking with PLCs, if we go back to the days of the relay, or if we have something that is totally islanded, then that meets our cybersecurity requirements and it's easier, we're more secure, we're more safe. And there's definitely some logic, some truth to that. I think the concern is, there's kind of a reason we moved from relays to PLCs in the first place. And losing the flexibility, losing the diagnostics, and really the information that comes from the PLCs, just imagine how many safety relays you would need in a petrochemical site or in a refinery. And then the issue becomes, are they going to be maintained and kept operational? So we're almost trading, the cybersecurity risk for some sort of increased failure, incomplete maintenance risk. So it's not to say that it never gets done. There may be specific applications where the consequence is so high that you may consider it, but you've got to balance that increased security with the ability to maintain it. And so it does still come down to a risk-based decision. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you guys very much for all of the questions. I hope you found this topic interesting and that it spurred some thoughts. Again, please don't hesitate to send me an email at pobrien@exida.com or to connect with me at LinkedIn. If you search Patrick O'Brien Exida, I should be pretty easy to find. And I'm looking forward to talking with all of you soon. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.